Welcome to Codex History of Video Games. I'm Mike Coletta.
And I'm Tyler Osby.
And today we're getting into the final chapter of the Ultimate History of Video Games Volume 2 by Stephen L. Kent. And this chapter is all about the relationship between movies and video games.
And art and video games in general. It's a very meta chapter because this is the last chapter, right?
This is the last chapter, and it's got to get very opinionated from us, I think, maybe a little bit. But yeah, that's maybe fine. That's maybe that's why you're here. And if it's not why you're here, well, sorry. Here we go.
I guess you buckle up, buddy.
Yeah. I didn't mean to sound so threatening up front.
So yeah, Kent starts off. He's talking about the Doom movie released in 2005, which is relevant to our interest because if you missed it, our 100th episode of this show is sort of like a Mystery Science Theater riff tracks commentary that you can listen to while you watch the Doom movie, and you can laugh with us at how the movie isn't actually that bad, but is still pretty bad and not a great example of a good video game movie because it really wasn't. It had those weird like first person sections and it just wasn't a great movie, but we talk about it and we have a lot of fun watching it. So you can watch it with us.
Yeah.
And critics didn't think the movie was very good. People didn't think the movie was very good. And the movie did not make back its budget of $60 million. But it did have Carl Urban, who would go on to become, kind of a decently big actor. He's in The Boys. He played Bones in the Star Trek reboot movies. So it didn't destroy his career, which was just starting to get off the ground.
And it didn't destroy Dwayne Johnson's career either.
Oh, I forgot The Rock was in that movie.
He's the bad guy in the movie.
That's right.
Yeah. Spoilers to a movie from 2005.
That movie is bad, but it does have Carl Urban and The Rock, so it's got some redeeming qualities.
It's one of those movies where you're like, you can watch this on a night with friends to make fun of the movie, and it's a good time.
Yeah.
Which is what we did. We just recorded it. So you can do that on yourself.
It's not, I wouldn't say it's like so bad it's good, but it is fun to make fun of. And it's not very long, I don't think, either. It's like under 2 hours, so...
Yeah, it's pretty
It's not
quick.
a big time commitment.
There is a newer Doom movie that is better, but I wouldn't say good.
Yeah,
That's kind of how I would describe it. It came out like in 2020, I believe.
Yeah, I haven't seen that one.
Yeah, it's not as bad as the 2005 one, but it's definitely not a great movie. You know what I mean?
Yeah, Roger Ebert has he reviewed the Doom movie, and he sums it up thusly. The movie has been inspired by, that's air quotes, inspired by the famous video game. No, I have never played it and never will, but I know how it feels to not play it because I've seen the movie. Doom is like some kid came over and is using your computer and won't let you play. I think that's a pretty accurate description.
Harsh but fair.
Yeah, harsh but fair. I don't generally agree with Roger Ebert on things, especially what we're going to talk about pretty soon. But I do agree with him on his assessment of the Doom movie. It's not very good, and it doesn't give you the experience of playing the game, and it does feel like not playing the game. So, yeah, that's a scathing review.
Scathing review, but I think he kind of nails it.
Yeah, and he was of the mind that a movie should be able to entertain on its own merits, even if you're not familiar with the source material, which I generally agree with. I think it depends. If it's like a theatrical movie, then I definitely agree. Like, it needs to be a good movie on its own. If it's designed to be a companion piece, like something like Advent Children for Final Fantasy VII, I think it's okay if it relies on the source material. Like, if you want to go watch Advent Children, you've never played Final Fantasy VII, you won't know what's going on in the movie, and that's okay. Like, it's not for you then. Also, if you watch the movie and you have played Final Fantasy VII, you won't know what's going on in the movie either, because it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But I do still enjoy it because it's very action-packed. And I watched it at a formative time in my life where I liked everything that I watched. So I still like Advent Children, but it's not a very good movie. Ebert's comments also sort of kicked off this larger conversation in the video game world that like are video games art that we're still having. This is still a conversation we're still having. Ebert thinks that they're not art, which I disagree with. And I think we're preaching to the choir here because we are video game fans on a video game podcast, and we're talking to other video game fans. So, I assume you disagree as well, Mike, that video games, I don't know. Well, what are your thoughts on our video games art?
I think video games are art.
Yeah.
I think it's been proven time and time again. And especially since, because Roger Ebert said this quite a long time ago. And if you may have believed that then, I truly think there are things now that have really, like, because art, I think telling a good story is art. And that's what so many good video games do.
Yeah, I think anything that can make you feel a feeling is art. And so what it comes down to is not like, do we disagree on whether games are art? It's actually with myself and Roger Ebert, at least in this imaginary fight that we're having. Like it's just about what your definition of art is. And I have a very broad definition. I think his is just more narrow than mine. And so we can argue over what the definition of art should be, but ultimately that's what the argument's about. It's not whether games are art or not. It's what your definition of art is, and then do games fit in there? Because Ebert thinks that art is inherently non-interactive, which I wholeheartedly disagree with. So like if that's what you think, we can have a discussion about whether or not art should be interactive. But if you just don't think that it should be, then of course you don't think video games are art, right?
Yeah, and I think on our Stephen L. Kent interview episode, we talked about how in that instance, then dance would not be art. And that's just blatantly not true.
Yeah, and art for the person performing the dance and also for the person watching the dance. I agree with you on that. Like, if that's what you think, that just games are interactive and therefore not art because art is non-interactive, I'm like, okay, well, I disagree. And that's sort of where that conversation ends for me. But people still have this conversation because I think gamers, at least in the past, and maybe this is changing now, or maybe I'm just older and I don't care what other people think as much as I used to, but people want this like validation from other more established art forms. So we keep talking about it, I guess, because a lot of gamers disagree. And like, this is something I could rant about, like the EA worst company ever thing from the last episode. But my opinion on this matter is that it doesn't matter, because I think games are art, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't change anything if you don't think games are art. And games don't need to be accepted by people like Roger Ebert. I don't care about his opinion. It's just not necessary. And Tim Schafer is quoted in the book as saying, if the person making the game thinks it's art and the person playing the game thinks it's art, then I don't think anyone could come in and say, no, it's not art. And I agree with that. And I don't think we should care. So those are sort of my feelings. But we continue talking about whether games are art.
People are too busy to argue about what console's the best than to argue about what's art anymore, you know?
Right. And Julian Egbrecht from Factor 5, he worked at Factor 5 and then he worked at Epic, and he has a quote in the book that I'm condensing it a little bit here, but it's, art is the abstract expression of human feelings in any medium, the conveyance of the innermost id by any means possible that can be perceived and interpreted by other humans. Video games are inherently a progression of mood and feelings, meaning one could even argue that they are the most perfect and complex art form yet. And I sort of agree with that.
I do too. That's a really good definition.
I think art is anything that like a human makes that creates a feeling in another human. And whether it's interactive, like that's a very broad definition. And I think that it is irrespective of quality. And I think some people's definition of art is like it needs to hit a certain quality bar or it's not art. And I think there's such a thing as bad art. So that's how I feel about that, I guess. But Ebert remained unconvinced. And while I'm not too familiar with him as a person, he seems like the kind of guy who would never back down from something he said, even if he regretted it. So he does not seem like the kind of person who changes his opinion on things, but maybe he has. If you know of a time Ebert changed his opinion on something, then send us an email. But I don't know of any, and he is no longer with us. So rest in peace, Roger Ebert. But yeah, I don't think anybody who plays or makes video games needs validation from other industries that they're art. They are or they aren't. Who cares? But Kent takes the next part to talk a bit about Tim Schafer's work. And he did a lot of like point and click adventures in the 90s, a genre which has largely disappeared these days. Games like Full Throttle, Secret of Monkey Island, Day of the Tentacle, those are some of his like more famous works. And Kent thinks that Ebert might have liked these things if he had actually given them a chance. But Ebert didn't even think all movies were art. Like I said, like his definition of art had like a quality bar, which is something I don't agree with. And so he would be like, nah, not all movies are art. Some of them are just, bad. I'm like, I think all movies are art. Some of them are bad, but, that's how I feel about that anyway.
Dude, the whole world of critiquing things is so hard to me. Like I first experienced it if you got a theater major at Washington State University in the late 2000s, you had to take a lit and critical class, like a critique class.
Mm-hmm.
This is so convoluted, and I just want a right or wrong answer, and there just isn't one. Yeah. And so that's why I have such a hard time being like, when someone's something like, that's just bad. It's like, but why is it bad? I can't even fathom this. I would never want to be a critic, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
It would be awful.
I agree with that. I guess it's a useful sort of like profession to a certain extent, I think folks like Roger Ebert are like very elitist about the things that they like, and like, I don't know, there's like an attitude there that I don't necessarily agree with. I think it's fine to talk about whether you like something or not, because I don't like everything, and but I try to like more things than I dislike. You know, that's my goal in life. Is I don't think you're more interesting for not liking things. That's something that I think folks like Roger Ebert, like, they feel like they're more interesting because they didn't like a thing. Like, you're not interesting just because you didn't like something.
It's like that kid in high school that always hated your favorite band, and you just hate it, and you're like, you're not hating it because you hate it. You're hating it because you're trying to make me mad, and it's working, Isaac.
God, Isaac hated everything.
He really did.
I feel bad for him now because it means he didn't like anything. He just talked about how bad everything was. Isaac.
Well, and it's also funny too, because in the day and age of now, where there's things like Yelp and Google reviews and everyone's a critic, you just realize how many people's opinions just don't matter to me.
Yep.
You know, like when you see a 1-star review for a restaurant because they couldn't get into the restaurant, you're like, this is not how it's supposed to go.
Yeah. Like, I'm sorry you had a bad time, but also this doesn't help me decide whether or not I want to eat here. If it was like a temporary blip, like, oh, sorry, you couldn't get in because it was full. Like, okay, that doesn't make the restaurant bad. It actually probably means the restaurant's good.
Yeah, like a product getting a bad review because of the shipping.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's the worst. Like, oh, yeah, but it arrived in a box that was all beat up. It still worked and everything was fine, but the box was beat up. And you're like, that's a UPS problem. That's not a...
Exactly. That has nothing to do with this Xbox controller you ordered.
Yeah. But Ebert also had some folks in the game industry that agreed with him. Tetsuya Mizuguchi, who designed arcade games like Sega Rally Championship, Space Channel 5, Luminous, Rez, and other games that I actually think are art, especially Luminous and Rez. But Mizuguchi didn't think games are art, at least not yet. He didn't think he doesn't think that they have the emotional impact that art requires, which I disagree with because, not every game hits like a ton of bricks, but I think we've all played a game that hits hard, right? Like, and the way that any good story can elicit an emotional reaction. Even my boy Hideo Kojima, the man who has made games that have made me cry, he agrees with Ebert too. Though he thinks that games are like bigger than art, he sees games as the museum that houses the art, but isn't the art itself, which is, I guess, just a different way of looking at it than I think taken as a whole, a game can be art. But if he thinks that it's full of gameplay and music and painting or whatever, like, that's fine too. I guess that's a perspective you can have.
See, isn't the art form of like bringing all those other art forms together to make that a thing?
Yeah, I agree.
That's why I have a hard time with the Hideo Kojima stance. I'm also so surprised that these two like legendary game designers agreed with Roger Ebert. But they also seemed like they agreed with Roger Ebert a bit. Not full on, but like a bit, you know?
Yeah.
Because they both had caveats to how it would go.
Right. And I think Mizuguchi, his is sort of like, I think his is that quality bar thing of like, games are not art yet, which sort of makes me feel like, oh, there's a certain quality bar that you need for something to be considered art, which is just something I disagree with. Bad art. See,
it's hard too, because it's like, okay, well, I think we would all agree, like a game like Firewatch or Last of Us, for people that's a way bigger game. That's art, right? Last of Us is art. It's telling you a story. It's got all these great moments, very cinematic, right?
Yeah.
But Candy Crush, is that art?
I think so, because my definition of art is sufficiently broad that it does encompass things like Candy Crush. Whether or not I think it's good art or high art or like has a whole lot to say, maybe not, but I do still think it's art. Because
it does make people happy, when you're on the bus or the train and you're playing. Also, I mean, those candies, they do look good. They look real good. The little models that they have, the sprites. I love them.
Yeah. Oh, they look tasty.
Very satisfying.
Yeah. So the book sort of then transitions into this thing of like games as culture more so than art. And Kelly Santiago, who did a whole TED Talk in response to Roger Ebert's comments, wrote an article for Kotaku that was a response to his response to her TED Talk. So he said games are not art. She gave a TED Talk, so here's why games are art. And then he responded to that saying, I still respectfully disagree. And then she responded to his response where she basically said, hey, talking about games as art is a fun exercise or like party conversation, but it's not really a serious debate anymore. And that's the thing I agree with. Like, it's fine if you want to sit here and talk about it, but it doesn't matter ultimately, right? It doesn't matter if people think games are art, because like games don't need validation from other like outside sources. Like if a game is worth playing, play it. If it's not, don't. It doesn't matter if it's art or not, you know? But I think we can all agree that games contribute to culture. And comic books went through a similar thing at one point too, with a big debate over whether or not comic books were art, right? Because there's art that goes onto the pages, and there's a story being told, but is it a good story and stuff like that. But in 2005, Time magazine put out a list of what the 100 best novels published in the English language, and Watchmen was on there. 1985's Watchmen by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. That's a graphic novel, and I would wholeheartedly agree that it is art. It is a very good story. The art is great on the pages. Big fan of Watchmen. I even liked the movie.
Me
even though
too.
No one else did.
I did too.
I liked how they ended it in the movie better than in the comic.
It's like a fun memory for me too, because when we went and saw that, I just started dating my now fiance, and we made cookies, like Watchmen cookies, the smiley faces, with little
nice.
jellies on them. Yeah, it was fun. It was good. It was a good time.
That's great. Yeah.
That's why I love Watchmen, the movie and the book.
Oh, that's a good memory. That's nice. Yeah, it's like it comes back to it. Like if someone doesn't think comics are art, then I don't care about their opinion on the matter, right? Like this isn't. If somebody comes up to me and is like, video games aren't art or comic books aren't art, I'm like, I don't care enough about your opinion to try to change it at this point. You might as well be telling me like 2 + 2 = 5. Prove me wrong, right? I'm like, I don't have to do that because you're just wrong.
Yeah, you're just trying to get a rise out of somebody at this point.
Yeah, exactly. It's like I'm not here to convince you. Like if you're that entrenched in your opinion on this, then like I don't value it, and I don't value it enough to change it. So I think as time moves on and the old people that defined culture in the past move on and also die, culture changes, and games are a part of culture. It's not even uncool anymore to be a nerd who plays video games. Like almost everybody plays video games the same way almost everyone watches movies or watches TV or reads books, right? Ready Player One, Wreck-It Ralph are cited by Kent as examples of how gaming culture has seeped its way into mainstream culture. And I agree. Like games stand on their own now, and the culture they've created themselves show up in other mediums, like Ready Player One and Wreck-It Ralph have characters from video games that originated in video games that are now like moving back into this more traditional culture thing of movies. Because like back in the day, games used to draw from, well, they still do to a certain extent, but like you would have to like get a license to use the likeness of a movie or a TV show or a comic book or whatever in your game to make the game sell. And nowadays, games sell on their own. You can't just slap SpongeBob on a game and expect it to make you money. It's got to be a good game first, like Mario, Grand Theft Auto, Call of Duty. Like these IPs all started as games, and they are the top selling games based on their own merits and the IP that those companies created. And Kent also cites Minecraft in this way, now that an entire generation of kids have grown up with the game since it came out in 2011, which makes me feel incredibly old that Minecraft is now over a decade old. And all these kids talk about how they grew up with Minecraft, and I was already a grown man when that game came out. So,
I remember downloading the alpha in college and playing.
Yeah. Like being an actual full-grown adult, and somebody was trying to get me to play it, and I didn't. And I kind of regret that. I should have played with them, but I didn't. So yeah, we're not done talking about video games and movies, are we, Mike?
No, of course we're not. And also, side note on Minecraft, I feel like the cool thing about Minecraft is people are making art in Minecraft.
Yeah.
Minecraft's almost like a canvas to do what you want with it. And I think that's in the same way like Lego is, you know? Yep. Two things I love. So I think it's really cool that that's just the way it is now. Also, the whole like video games as culture thing. Imagine like when humans are gone, which, you know, maybe sooner than later. Who knows that things are. And like something visits Earth and sees the statue of the orc riding the warg in front of the Blizzard office, but not knowing it's a video game thing. That might be our culture.
Yep. Yeah.
That could be it. I just think about that a lot. I think it's funny. Okay, so this next section is called The Mostly Bad History of Games Based on Movies. And I'm kind of the opinion that this might be changing.
I think so. I think we're getting some better movies these days.
Yeah, and I also, I thought about the Spider-Man games specifically, you know, because Spider-Man 2 was based on the movie and it was the game. But it's kind of hard with comic book ones because comic book movies are also, based on the characters, you could argue, instead of movies.
Yeah.
But maybe I'm just trying to be optimistic that this is changing. But regardless of what you think, Kent starts us out with Steven Spielberg's Jaws. And Jaws was important because in the movie, they show kids playing a video game called Killer Shark, in which you fire a rifle, like a plastic rifle on the screen. And so this is where you see a video game in a movie. You know, this is where it's starting.
Mm-hmm.
And there are also other shark games mentioned too, but most important is the game that Atari released called Shark Jaws. And notice how Jaws is in the title. That's because Nolan Bushnell wanted to license Jaws and make the game. And when Universal Studios said no, he just changed the name and released the game anyway. And this is kind of the start of rushed games that capitalize on the success of a movie. And Jaws, I mean, if we were doing a movie history podcast, would be, I mean, that's like the first summer blockbuster, you could say. And when we now have this culture of releasing movies between May and August as like, this is the prime time for big budget action movies. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about games based on movies. So some of the games, though, I should say, were good. Kent mentions the early 80s games like the Tron arcade games. I think in 1983 is when those came out. And then also Atari's Star Wars Arcade, which is still a great game. If you go to your local arcade and see Star Wars Arcade, I spent so much time on that machine and I'm so bad at it, but it's so fun. Really good. Have you played it, Tyler?
I don't think I have, no.
Oh, it's really cool. There's also the Raiders of the Lost Ark game for the Atari 2600 that was created by Howard Scott Warshaw, and that game was very well received. But unfortunately for Warshaw, he is not remembered for Raiders of the Lost Ark. He's more remembered for the next game, E.T.
Here we go.
And we've talked about E.T. a lot on the podcast, and I don't want to talk about it too much more.
I feel like the first Ultimate History of Video Games book talked about
it. Really did. It really did. So if you want to go listen to our early episodes about that, you can. But if you don't know, E.T. was a game that did not cause the video game crash of 1983, but boy, did it sure help push that along. We've talked about it before, but Kent mentions in the Ultimate History of Video Games Volume 2, like kind of a TLDR quick list, so I'll go through that. The first thing that happened is Warner Communications offered Spielberg a $25 million advance for this game just to get it out as fast as possible and give him the money. And so the game was then rushed through production so it'd be ready for Christmas. And then rather than basing the gameplay on the movie, Spielberg wanted a Pac-Man-like game instead because the maze chase genre was the thing at the time.
That was the hotness.
Yeah, and that's why they did that. And E.T. is a lesson that movie and game studios didn't really learn for a while, and that lesson is a rushed game with a movie license, while it might sell, is not going to be properly quality controlled and tested, and you're not going to have fun. Like, E.T. is almost impossible to beat in certain situations because you get stuck in a bottomless pit and you can't get out. So, there's that.
And that's it.
Mike Mika's quote on page 490 sums this up really well by saying, quote, "It didn't matter what they were. As long as they could boot up, the publishers didn't really care," end quote. And he's describing any game based on a movie at this time. Does it boot? Ship it. Here we go.
Yeah, let's just get some easy cash here. Games are a fad anyway. Where, this is all going downhill. Get some money out of it while we can. Let's not work too hard on this stuff.
Exactly. And Vince Desi, who's the former managing partner of Rydell Software Productions, he worked on 50 licensed titles, like over 50 licensed titles in his career. And he gives the reason why these games are so bad. Oftentimes, the quote's really long. I'm not going to read it, but to summarize it, he says that a publisher is paying a really steep licensing fee and is indebted to pay that royalty regardless of how the game sells. So they usually, not all the time, but usually underpay the developer and rush the development schedule so they could just get the game out and recoup their costs as fast as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And they also they just want to appease the licensor so then they can get another license after that. And then on top of that, like I said, the development window is super small because the game needs to be finished either by the theater release date or more recently in the 90s by the VHS or DVD date. Now, like licensed games, they can come out like a little later, like streaming date instead. So you have a little more time. But usually licensed games all come out in September to December for the holidays, and that automatically overcrowds the market. too. So that was a problem back then as well. Before streaming and digital storefronts, they actually had an even bigger problem, and that was manufacturing. You had 5 months to develop the game because it needed to be manufactured, oftentimes in China, and you had to have that shipped over to you afterward. And the physical copies Mika mentions, they're cheaper if they go from China to America on a very slow boat ride, and they're more expensive on a plane ride shipping. And straight up, you would want to do the boat to save money. So they would rush development even more. Like they'd knock another 2 months off of development time.
Dang.
To get the, yeah. So these are
just for shipping purposes. So yeah. Wow. Just literally saving money in making development time shorter because of that. Like because of just the physics involved with moving large amounts of copies of things.
And date-wise, I know it's kind of vague, but we're talking like 80s and 90s is when we're talking about this time, because this is really when the licensing was super big for video games to movies. And, I mean, the licensed titles did help the studios a lot. That's the other problem, is it got the name out there of the studio, and it funded, like, their cool non-licensed games. Like, the games that everyone at the studio was excited to make. The licensed games funded those.
So they weren't even the developers were like not into making these games because their heart wasn't in it either. They're just looking for the payday so they could fund the games that they wanted to make.
Exactly. And Kent uses the example of Digital Eclipse, the studio, and they made a lot of Lilo and Stitch and Kim Possible games. And those games kind of funded their really amazing Game Boy Color port of Dragon's Lair. So they took this classic game Dragon's Lair and just made a more modern version of it. And and that was kind of a passion project for the developers at Digital Eclipse. So in the way that E.T. was inspired by Maze Chase games, because that's what Spielberg knew to be all the rage in the 80s and in the 80s, the 90s, my time growing up, was all about platforming. Do you remember this, Tyler?
Yeah. Every movie that came out, every Disney movie had a platformer of varying quality to go along with it on Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis.
Yeah, everyone did. And there's this really good story. It's a good story, but it's very tragic in its own way, that Mike Mika tells about making a Lizzie McGuire game. And essentially all the developers, think of it, it's like all these mid-30s male developers studied and watched a lot of Lizzie McGuire to get a game that they think kids, well, it would be young girls would like. That's the demographic. And so what they came up with is this PDA game where you have your PDA and there's like a pet simulator in it and other stuff. And that was the game, right? THQ signs off on this because they clearly didn't read the proposal. They were just like, yeah, that sounds great. Here you go. They just sign off. So the team makes the PDA game, and when they present it to THQ to go show it at like a trade show, THQ is very mad. They're like, what is this? This isn't what we wanted. And then, so the result of this story is Mike Mika going to a hotel room the weekend of the show, making a platformer called Cheerleaders Attack.
Oh,
and
wow.
Mika describes it as, quote, the most milquetoast, boring platformer you could ever imagine. And they loved it. They thought it was exactly what the audience would want. So platforming fatigue actually paved the way for some creativity and some really good games to come out of it. And Kent highlights again the LucasArts games of the 90s that Tyler mentioned with like Day of the Tentacle. Wasn't that Tim Schafer? He was with LucasArts.
Yeah, I think that was all under the LucasArts banner. I could be wrong about that. But
yeah, I think it is. It's Grim Fandango's another one too.
Yeah,
I believe, right? But also the 1992 Indiana Jones and the Fate of Atlantis game, which is actually a really cool game that I've always wanted to play, and I should check it out. And 1993's Star Wars X-Wing and Star Wars TIE Fighter, which I remember playing as a kid, as well as 1995 Star Wars Dark Forces, which is a very cool game. Kent kind of jumps ahead too and talks about KOTOR, which is my personal favorite game of all time, and I really need to play that. But there's just no time. There's no time to play games. There's so many games. It's a long game.
Knights of the Old Republic. Long game.
It really is a long game. On top of LucasArts, Disney had some really strong showings as well. Castle of Illusion, starring Mickey Mouse, that's the full title, and Quackshot, starring Donald Duck. Those were some very big games. Virgin Interactive is known for making the best Disney platformers, like the ones from my childhood that I really know. and I'm talking about Aladdin specifically. Aladdin was the first one. That Sega Genesis version of Aladdin, made by Virgin Interactive, is really, really good. And they would go on to make The Lion King and other notable Disney platforming games as well. What's weird is they were still platformers in this time of platforming fatigue, but they were just really well done.
Yeah, there was some good stuff there. What I'm noticing, with the exception of Aladdin and Lion King, the common thread with these good games are games that aren't based directly on a movie. So like Star Wars X-Wing, Star Wars TIE Fighter, they're not like, Return of the Jedi, the game, right? They're like games on their own that are in the Star Wars universe. Same with Dark Forces and all the games that spawned. Knights of the Old Republic is its own storyline. It's its own thing. It just is in the Star Wars universe. I think the bad games are the ones that are just like, Toy Story, the game. Actually, that game was pretty good, but the ones that are just directly based on the movie, those ones tend to be not as good.
Yeah, I remember as a kid really liking the Hook game for Super Nintendo. And the more I think about it, the more I'm like, that might have been like considered a bad platforming game.
There is something to be said for being like a child when these games came out, and like everything you played was good because you didn't have any taste.
That's true. It was also very hard, if I remember. But it was really cool because you could fly. You could be Peter Pan.
Nice.
Yeah, you'd fly through the level. It was really sweet once you got that power. I think Kent's quote on page 496 says it best regarding video game movie licensing. And it's, quote, "The video game industry was learning a lesson the pinball industry had learned as well. Licensing movie titles doesn't make bad games playable."
Yep.
And that's so true. There's so many licensed pinball games. And some of them are cool, but they're not fun. They're just cool.
Right.
looking.
And they're not cool because they're licensed. They're cool because they're good pinball games on their own, right?
Exactly. Although I am a sucker for seeing like a really crazy model in the middle of a pinball table based on a movie and being like, I need to play this game. They know how to get, is what I'm saying. EA is also briefly mentioned at the end of this chapter regarding their licensing as well, because they had Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, James Bond, and The Godfather. And while I've played a few of those, and I would tend to agree they were like good games, the only ones I really, really liked were Lord of the Rings 2 Towers and 007 Nightfire.
Oh, Nightfire is great.
It's a great game. Nightfire is a great game.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where we're going to leave it off here. Next week, we're going to continue talking about superhero games, which I'm very excited to talk about. And then also games that were turned into movies. We did movies into games. Now we're going to do games into movies next week.
I'm excited for that because we are entering a bit of a renaissance here. I think we're starting to get some good movies based on games, or at least movies based on games that are not bad, which I guess is the bar right now.
The bar is not horrible, like watchable, entertaining. We're thinking about like the new Sonics, right? I haven't seen the new Sonics. I need to watch that. I might do that this week.
The new one comes out next weekend. And I'm going to go see it on opening day, I think. And the Uncharted movie that just came out was not too bad.
Oh, yeah.
I enjoyed it. I think it's worth watching.
Is that theater only?
I think so, yeah.
That's how they get you now. They know.
Yep.
They're learning. Gosh, when all the movies came out and you can just watch them at home, that was the best.
That was the best. Oh,
Real
man.
good time. All right, so Tyler, what you been playing?
I've been playing Destiny 2, but I haven't been playing as many games this week because I'm still going to sleep early and waking up early as a result of the travel that I did the past couple of weeks. So I haven't been like, most of my game playing time is like late at night. But I did play a bunch of Destiny last night. I finally stayed up late, played Destiny. And I've been playing more Pokemon Legends Arceus. That I find it fun to play that while something else is going on in the background. So that's kind of it. I don't think I've been playing much else. I did make it to Platinum on League of Legends Wild Rift for the mobile phone, which was very fun. I'm having a good time with that because they're like faster versions of League of Legends. And it's easy to play by yourself. And I think the ranked system is fun. But that's kind of it. What have you been playing?
I'm kind of the same. I've been playing a lot of Destiny this week when like by my free time, but I really haven't had a lot of free time this week, so I didn't really play a lot of games. Yeah. I'm hoping to take my Switch with me when I do comedy next week. I'll be in Las Vegas next week if anyone wants to go see me do comedy at the Laugh Factory at the Tropicana. I'll be there. Right. But I plan on bringing my Switch then and finishing Pokemon Arceus. That's the goal this coming weekend.
Are you going to do like the post-game stuff or just finish the story?
I'm going to finish the story because the post-game stuff I've heard takes hours and hours and hours. So I'm going to start it, but I don't know if I'll have enough time to do it because I heard you got to get every single Pokedex entry done, right?
Oh, jeez. That sounds like a slog.
Yeah, I mean, I'll try, but we'll see how long I stick to it. I might come back to it. I also really want to get a new Switch game. I love Pokemon, don't get me wrong, but I want to play Metroid or Kirby. I've heard the Kirby game is really good.
I've heard it's pretty good too, yeah. I've heard good things about that.
So I was kind of thinking about one of those next, but I still have Black Mesa to play. I still have Witcher 3 to play. I've just put those on hold for a bit and I'll go back to them. But yeah, I'm having a good time. It's just this last week was kind of very, very busy for me. So I'm hoping it'll ease up a little bit. But we have one email to read today. You want to read the email, Tyler?
Yeah, I will read this email. The email's subject line is, "You guys are awesome," which is a nice subject line. Thank you for that. Hey, Mike and Tyler, I'm the last real player alive, and I just want to let you guys know that the work you put into this podcast is excellent. You two have chemistry on the mic, and both personalities complement each other well. Keep up the good work, homies. P.S. This should be taught in schools, I say, and I agree. Start the petition to make Codex a class in school, and you could just go and listen to Codex every day, and that's class.
Honestly, that's kind of why I've tried to keep it clean this whole time, because how cool would it be if someone taught our podcast in a school just for a day? That would be cool.
Yeah. Or it could be one of those extra credit things, like listen to an episode of Codex and summarize it. And, that seems like a good extra credit.
You could do it for a business class because there's a lot of business tomfoolery that goes on with these video game companies.
True,
licensing stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't have to be about games. It can be about the business of games.
The business of art.
The business of art. The art of business.
The art of business.
All right. So I think that's going to be it for today. If you want to send us an email, you can send us an email to codexhistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also join our Discord. You can get a link either through the email, and I'll send you one, or you can go to my Twitter profile @mecoletta, MECOLETTA. Tyler's on Twitter too, @SneakerElf, ELPH. Please go ahead and tell your friends about us. You can leave us a review or follow us on your favorite podcasting app. And I think that's it today. Do you want to say bye to everybody, Tyler?
Sure. Goodbye, everybody.